Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video, commenting where you're watching from and at what time, and subscribing to keep these chilling stories coming. Now, let's dive into these unsettling tales. It was one of those nights where everything felt a little too quiet. The kind of silence that seems almost unnatural, waiting for something to happen. I was 18, a high school senior, living in a pretty average suburban neighborhood in San Mateo, California. My parents were out of town for the weekend visiting family, so I had the house to myself. Most of my friends were busy, and I wasn't in the mood to go out anyway. I was perfectly content to curl up on the couch with some junk food and watch TV for the night. I turned on the TV, the soft glow of the screen lighting up the living room in the otherwise dark house. The clock on the wall read 8:47 p.m., but it felt much later. There was a certain stillness in the air, the kind that made you feel like you were the only one left awake in the entire world. I couldn't help but feel the weight of the silence press in on me. I pulled the blanket tighter around me and distracted myself with a random show. Then my phone buzzed on the coffee table. I grabbed it, thinking it was just a text from a friend, but when I saw the name, I froze for a second. It was from Mrs. Parker, the elderly woman who lived next door. She had lived there for as long as I could remember. We had become friendly over the years. She was the type of neighbor who always baked cookies and brought over homemade jam. A sweet lady, but a little strange at times, like she had a past she didn't talk about much. She was kind of a recluse, and honestly, I hadn't seen her in a few days. Her message read, "Hey, sweetheart, can you do me a favor? I think my basement door is open. I heard noises. Can you check?" I blinked at the message, my thumb hovering over the screen. The tone was casual, but there was something off about it. Mrs. Parker wasn't one to ask for help, especially not over something like this. I looked out the window. The sun had already set, and the street was bathed in the dim orange light of the streetlights. Her house sat just a few feet from mine. An old two-story home with faded white paint and creeping ivy climbing up the sides. It had that old-time charm, but in the quiet of the night, it looked a little too lonely. I stood up from the couch, my sneakers feeling heavier than usual, and slipped my phone into my pocket. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and headed out the door. My stomach twisted, but I told myself it was just the darkness getting to me. I was 18, too old to be spooked by an old lady's basement door. The air outside was cool, crisp, and smelled faintly of pine and wet earth. As I crossed the yard, I looked up at Mrs. Parker's house. There was only one light on in the kitchen, and the rest of the house was dark. It struck me as odd because I usually saw her in the evenings, sitting at her kitchen table with a book or doing some cross-stitching. But tonight, there was no movement. Just that one solitary light. When I reached her front door, I found it was unlocked. This wasn't like her either. Mrs. Parker was always very particular about locking up, especially at night. A small feeling of unease crept up my spine, but I pushed it away and stepped inside. "Mrs. Parker?" I called softly, my voice trembling a little. No answer. The air inside the house was musty, like it hadn't been opened up in days. It smelled faintly of lavender and old wood. I called her name again, a little louder this time, but still there was no response. I stepped further inside, the floorboards creaking beneath me. The house felt like it had been abandoned for much longer than a few days. There was an odd chill in the air. I paused at the base of the stairs, looking up toward the second floor. It was completely silent, too quiet, in fact. I could feel the weight of the silence in my chest pressing down on me, but there was no time to dwell on it. I had a job to do. I made my way to the basement door, which was slightly ajar. My heart skipped a beat. The door was never left open. Mrs. Parker was always so careful about keeping it locked. My mind raced with thoughts of burglars or some other danger, but I couldn't just leave it like this. I reached for the handle, my hand shaking as I turned it. But before I could even open the door fully, a hand shot out from the darkness and shoved me inside with terrifying force. The door slammed shut behind me, plunging me into darkness. For a second, I couldn't breathe. I staggered forward, my heart pounding in my chest. The smell in the basement was overwhelming, damp and sour, like mildew mixed with something foul. I tried to calm myself down, my hands trembling as I fumbled for my phone, the flashlight app glowing to life. The beam of light flickered weakly, barely illuminating the space in front of me. The basement was cold and cramped, with stone looked ancient and chipped. There were boxes stacked in the corners, some with old fabric draped over them, others spilling open with forgotten things. But what caught my attention, what made my blood freeze in my veins, was the shape tied to a chair in the center of the room. A woman, gagged and barely moving, her body slumped forward. It took me a moment to process what I was seeing. Then my heart nearly stopped when I recognized her. It was Mrs. Parker. She was alive, barely, but she was there, tied up, and something was horribly wrong. I stumbled forward, breathless, and began to untie the ropes around her wrists. The moment I touched her, I felt her skin cold and clammy, her breath shallow. I could hear her struggling to make a sound, but the gag kept her from speaking. Then I heard it. Footsteps. The floor above me creaked. "Didn't think we'd get two tonight," a voice muttered, low and cold. My stomach dropped. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The text hadn't been from Mrs. Parker. It was from the intruder who had taken her. And now I was trapped too. A panic I had never felt before surged through me, my thoughts racing. I needed to get out of there, but I couldn't leave Mrs. Parker behind. The sound of footsteps on the stairs echoed from above, louder now. Someone was coming down. I turned to face the dark basement door, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to act fast. I could hear the heavy footsteps above me. The sound echoed, slow and deliberate, like someone was taking their time to descend. I tried to steady my breathing, but my chest felt tight, like the air was being sucked out of the room. My hands shook uncontrollably as I continued to untie Mrs. Parker. The ropes felt like they were made of steel, and every second that passed made it harder to focus. I needed to get her out of here. I needed to get both of us out of this nightmare. The light from my phone flashlight flickered again, making the shadows seem even darker. "Please, please," I whispered, my voice barely audible, trying to reassure myself as much as her. I finally got the last knot undone. Mrs. Parker's arms fell limply to her sides, and she let out a soft groan. "Mrs. Parker, can you hear me? Are you okay?" I whispered urgently. She gave a weak, almost imperceptible nod, but she couldn't speak. I could see the terror in her eyes and the helplessness that matched my own. I glanced over my shoulder and my heart stopped. The figure descends the stairs. My stomach dropped, and for a moment I froze. The only thing I could think of was getting away, getting out of there, but there was nowhere to hide. Nowhere to run. "Thought you might try to save her," the man said, his voice low, almost casual. There was something chilling about the way he spoke, like he didn't even consider the possibility that I might be able to fight back. "But you're too late." The weight of his words settled over me, suffocating. Panic surged in my chest, making my heart race even faster. I couldn't just sit there and let him get away with it. I had to do something. I glanced around frantically, trying to find anything I could use as a weapon. My mind raced, but everything in the basement was too far away, out of reach. Then my eyes landed on a rusted metal pipe leaning against the wall next to a stack of old crates. It was a long shot, but it was the only thing I had. I quietly moved towards it, trying to make as little noise as possible, my heart hammering in my ears. I grabbed the pipe, feeling its weight in my hands. It was cold and rough, and for a brief second, It felt like the only thing separating me from whatever nightmare this man had planned. My fingers curled tightly around it, and I stood, my legs shaking beneath me. My mind screamed for me to act, to do something before it was too late. Then, as soon as the man appeared, I didn't think, I just reacted. I swung the pipe as hard as I could, the metal clanging against his face with a sickening thud. He let out a low, guttural curse as he stumbled backward, clutching his face. His bloodshot eyes filled with rage as he looked up at me. But I didn't give him a chance to recover. I grabbed Mrs. Parker's hand and yanked her to her feet, adrenaline flooding my veins. "We have to go now," I screamed. Her body was weak, and it took a moment for her to get her bearings, but she followed me as I practically dragged her towards the basement door. My mind was in a fog, panic clouding every thought. The man behind us was regaining his composure, and I could hear him muttering curses under his breath. We started up the stairs, my legs shaking with every step. I could barely hear anything other than the sound of my heartbeat thumping in my chest. My hand fumbled for the basement door handle, and the seconds felt like hours. Finally, I managed to push the door open. I pulled Mrs. Parker through, my pulse racing as I tried not to think about the man who was just behind us. We had to move fast. I reached for the door, and in one swift motion, I slammed it shut behind us, locking it. We were out. We were free. But I didn't stop there. I didn't breathe a sigh of relief yet. I grabbed Mrs. Parker's hand and dragged her toward the back door. Every step was shaky, but we had to get outside, away from the house, away from him. I flung open the door and pulled Mrs. Parker out onto the porch. The night air felt cool against my skin, but there was no time to appreciate it. I slammed the door behind us, hearing the sound of footsteps rushing toward the basement door. I fumbled with my phone, my hands slick with sweat, and dialed 911. My voice cracked when I spoke. "There's a man in the house. He kidnapped Mrs. Parker. You need to send help. Now." I told them the address. The operator's voice was calm, reassuring. "Help is on the way. Stay where you are." I stood frozen, staring at the house, heart still hammering. The police couldn't get here fast enough. The sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer, but the relief I should have felt didn't come immediately. It was as if the air itself still clung to the suffocating tension that had been choking us in that basement. Even though we were out, even though Mrs. Parker was no longer bound and helpless in that filthy, damp room, I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. It felt like the night wasn't done with me yet. As we stood there on the sidewalk, waiting for the police to arrive, Mrs. Parker leaned against me, her frail body trembling. She was alive, thank God, but she was in shock, barely able to stand on her own. I tried to keep my hands steady as I held her up, my mind still racing, trying to process everything. My phone clutched tightly in my hand. My fingers felt like they were still numb from the adrenaline. I kept glancing at the house, her house, now just a hollow shell of a place that had been home for so long. When the first patrol car pulled up, it was like a dam had broken inside me. I couldn't help the flood of tears that came, even though I'd been trying so hard to hold myself together. An officer hurried toward us, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, and I barely recognized my own voice as I told him what had happened. "We need to go inside," I said, wiping my eyes. "The man, he's in there. He was going to, he almost." The officer's face hardened. "We'll take care of it. Stay here." They ushered me to the sidewalk, and I watched as they went into the house. Another officer checked on Mrs. Parker, while the rest stormed the building, going room by room, making sure there was no one else hiding. I kept looking back at the house, hoping that I wouldn't see him standing in the doorway watching us. I couldn't help it. My mind was still reeling. I kept thinking about the way the man had spoken, so casually, so certain that he was in control. That voice. I could still hear it in my head, the coldness of it, as if he had done this before. I couldn't stop myself from shuddering. The police kept us separated, asking us questions, making sure Mrs. Parker was okay, but I couldn't focus. My brain kept flashing back to those moments in the basement. The door slamming behind me, the man's hand on my back, shoving me in, Mrs. Parker tied to the chair, her broken, terrified face. And then those footsteps, that voice. Minutes later, an officer came back, his face grim. "We've got him," he said. "He's under arrest." I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. Mrs. Parker's eyes welled up with tears as she looked toward the house, like she couldn't believe it was over either. I walked over to her, putting an arm around her shoulder, not sure if she was even aware of me doing it, but I needed to be there. The police did their job, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something still wasn't right. "You're safe now," I whispered to her, trying to reassure both of us, but I couldn't make my voice steady. The whole thing still felt like a bad dream, but it wasn't. It was real. The officer who had spoken earlier came back to us with some paperwork, telling us they would be taking the man in for questioning. His name was Rick Carlson. He was a drifter, someone who had been in and out of the area over the past few years. The officers said they had been searching for him for a while, but didn't have enough evidence to tie him to anything serious. Until now. The officers were still taking notes, but the adrenaline had worn off, and I felt nothing but exhaustion. It was only then that I realized how deeply my hands were trembling. I had to sit down on the curb, my legs too weak to hold me up anymore. The weight of everything that had happened in the last few hours was finally crashing down on me. But despite the exhaustion, despite the terror that still clung to me like a shadow, there was something else, a strange cold calm that had settled into my chest. I'd survived. Mrs. Parker had survived. I looked up at her, still sitting beside me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes distant. She was safe now. But as the police car drove off with Rick Carlson in the back, I couldn't stop wondering, what if I hadn't gone next door? What if I hadn't gotten to her in time? I glanced over at Mrs. Parker and saw the fear in her eyes again, the same terror she had in the basement. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely audible. You saved me." I nodded, but I wasn't sure I'd ever feel truly safe again. The thought gnawed at me, even hours later when I finally made it back home. I had no idea how to shake it, no idea how to escape the feeling that, even though we had escaped, we were both still trapped in some way, trapped in the shadow of what had almost happened. It's funny, before that night, I had always felt safe here, in this quiet little suburban neighborhood in California. A small, cozy house with a tiny yard, a safe little bubble that I never thought could be punctured. I'm Claire, by the way. I'd been living in this house for about 2 years, sharing it with a couple of roommates from college. On any given evening, it's usually peaceful. Just the hum of the air conditioning in the summer, the sound of leaves rustling in the trees outside. It wasn't a mansion, but it was my home. I spent most of my time here when I wasn't at school or work, and it was the perfect place to come back to after a long day of studying or serving at a local cafe. That night, though, things felt different. It was late, probably around 11 p.m. My roommates had gone out for the night, one to study at the library, the other off at some party. I had no plans and no particular desire to go anywhere. I wasn't really the type to party. I liked quiet nights in, so I grabbed a frozen pizza from the freezer and put on a horror movie I'd been meaning to watch for a while. Something lighthearted, but a little creepy. Nothing too serious. The house felt empty in a way that I wasn't used to. My roommates were usually here, their voices filling the space with casual chatter and music. Now, it was just me and the faint whir of the ceiling fan above me. The kind of quiet that fills the room, sitting heavily in your ears. It wasn't unsettling. It was just quiet. comfortable even. The kind of silence you don't notice unless you're really paying attention. I settled onto the couch, the blanket draped over my lap, and took a bite of pizza, the cheesy warmth, a small comfort. The TV was casting a flickering glow over the room, again, making everything feel cozy in that way only movie nights can. I couldn't even tell you exactly what the movie was about, some silly slasher flick, but it was enough to occupy my mind. I wasn't even thinking about the time. I remember the night being especially still, though. The temperature was mild, just warm enough to make the air conditioning feel good, but not so hot that I was uncomfortable. The windows were open, and I could hear the occasional rustling from outside. Not wind, but the sound of the trees swaying, a kind of steady, soft whoosh of leaves brushing together. There was something oddly peaceful about it, if I'm being honest. The kind of night that made you feel safe, like nothing bad could ever happen in a place so quiet, so familiar. That is, until my phone buzzed. It wasn't unusual for my phone to buzz at that hour. Texts from friends, maybe a call from my mom. But when I saw that it was an unknown number, something in my gut shifted. It was late. Almost too late for anyone to be calling me, especially someone I didn't know. I thought about ignoring it, just turning it face down and forgetting about it. I even considered letting it go to voicemail, but I guess my curiosity got the better of me. So I picked up the phone. "Hello?" I said, trying to keep my voice light, even though my heart had already started to race a little. For a moment, there was nothing on the other end, just silence. That heavy, almost suffocating silence. I could hear my own breath, slow and steady, but the tension in the air was growing thicker. Then suddenly, there was a sound. Not a voice, but a breath. A low, almost guttural inhale. It sent a chill crawling up my spine. "Claire," the voice said. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a scream, not exactly, just a whisper. But somehow the way my name was said, it sounded too familiar, too knowing. Like the person on the other side wasn't a stranger at all. I didn't know how to respond. It felt like my mind was frozen. The voice wasn't threatening, not outright, but the way it whispered my name, like it was speaking from some deep, dark place, made my skin crawl. There was something about it that didn't sit right. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to sound confident, though my voice cracked a little despite my efforts. But before I could say anything more, the line went dead. The sudden silence was deafening. I sat there, staring at the phone in my hand, willing the person on the other end to call back. But the screen remained blank. No incoming calls, no messages. I couldn't stop looking at it, expecting it to light up with a name, a number, anything. I should have just brushed it off, told myself it was a prank call, a wrong number, or someone messing with me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Maybe it was the fact that the person had said my name, or maybe it was just the timing. It was too late for this to be a random call. I immediately blocked the number, hoping that would end it, that I wouldn't have to think about it again. But then, just as I was about to settle back on the couch, I heard something else. At first, it was so faint I wasn't sure I'd actually heard it. A rustling sound. A scraping noise, like something being dragged across the ground. It was coming from the backyard, but I couldn't be sure. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, maybe a branch swaying or the trees rubbing against each other, but it didn't feel right. The wind didn't make that noise. I held my breath, listening closely. There it was again, a soft, almost deliberate rustling, like someone walking around just outside the yard. I knew it wasn't an animal, not with the way it was moving. Slow, methodical. Almost like whoever was out there was trying not to make noise, but failing. My stomach knotted. I stood up slowly, my legs suddenly feeling unsteady. I wasn't sure why I was scared. It was just a sound, after all. But something told me I needed to check. Something told me that it wasn't just the wind. I crept toward the window, keeping my movements slow and quiet. I didn't want to alert anyone, whoever might be outside, that I was awake. I carefully parted the blinds, just enough to peek through the gap. My backyard was dark, the porch light casting long, uneven shadows across the grass. Everything looked normal at first glance, but then I saw it. A shape, a figure, standing in the shadows just outside of the porch light's reach. A tall figure, wearing dark clothing, blending in with the night. I couldn't make out any details, the face, the clothing, nothing, but I could feel it. The figure wasn't just standing there, it was waiting, watching. My breath hitched, and my heart started to race again. My first instinct was to step back, to hide, but I couldn't pull myself away from the window. I stood frozen, my hands shaking, my mind trying to make sense of what I was seeing, or rather, what I wasn't seeing. I stayed like that for what felt like forever, staring at the figure, hoping that somehow, someway, they would move on. But they didn't. The figure just stood there, unmoving, like they were waiting for something. For me. My stomach twisted in knots. And then I heard it. The sound of the back door handle, rattling. It was so sudden, so unexpected that my entire body tensed. The cold air in the room seemed to freeze, and I swear I could hear my heart thudding in my chest. The noise was unmistakable. Someone was at my back door. I backed away from the window, my body going cold with fear. My mind was racing. What do I do? What do I do? I grabbed my phone again, my hands clammy and shaking. The screen lit up, and I quickly pressed the 911 number. The line rang twice before it picked up. 911, what's your emergency? The operator asked. I could barely speak, my voice a whisper. There's someone outside. I think they're trying to break in. Stay calm, the operator said, her voice firm but reassuring. Lock yourself in a room. We've dispatched officers. I hung up, but by then, the door handle rattled again, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps on gravel. The sound of someone walking, circling my house. And I realized then, with a sickening clarity, that I was not alone. I was being watched. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, the blood rushing so loudly in my head that it almost drowned out everything else. I felt frozen, as if my body was betraying me by not moving, by not taking action. The figure I had seen, was it still there? Was it watching me? Every rational thought in my mind screamed at me to hide, to find some way to protect myself, but I couldn't tear myself away from the window. It felt like I was glued to the spot, like my body was too scared to take a step. The footsteps outside continued. They were slow at first, like someone was casually walking around the house, maybe inspecting it, maybe looking for a way in. Then there was a shift in the rhythm. It became quicker, more deliberate, as if the person knew exactly what they were doing now. I felt the cold sweat forming on my neck, a bead of it trickling down my spine. I told myself I was imagining things. I had to be. There was no way anyone would be out there in the middle of the night on a regular Tuesday in the suburbs. But deep down, I knew I wasn't imagining it. The fear was too raw, too real. The footsteps weren't a figment of my imagination. The shadows outside weren't just a trick of the light. There was someone there. I gripped the edge of the windowsill tighter, willing myself to breathe. My phone was still in my other hand, still locked on the 911 call screen. I wasn't sure why I hadn't hung up yet. Maybe I thought I could hear something over the line, some sign that help was on the way. I hadn't dared speak since the operator told me to lock myself in a room. I was too afraid to make a noise, too afraid that the person outside might hear me and know I was aware of them. And then came the worst sound of all, the back door handle rattling once again. But this time it wasn't a random shake. It was purposeful. There was force behind it. The door was being tested. The intruder was trying to get in. They weren't just standing outside anymore. They weren't lingering in the shadows. No, now they were actively trying to break in. My legs felt like they might give out beneath me. I backed away from the window, clutching my phone tighter, as if the device could somehow protect me. I retreated into the living room, where the television's muted glow felt oddly comforting in the sudden silence. The sound of my breath was too loud, too sharp, like I was trapped inside my own chest. It felt like my heart might explode from the pressure. I couldn't stay in the living room. I knew that. I had to move. I didn't even think about what to do next. I just moved. My feet carried me automatically into the kitchen. In the corner, the knife block caught my eye, its shiny silver blades catching the light. I grabbed the largest one, feeling the weight of it in my hand. It felt almost absurdly comforting for a split second, this simple, heavy object, as though it might somehow make me feel less vulnerable, less exposed. But I knew it wasn't enough. A kitchen knife wasn't going to protect me from whatever was out there. I darted back to my bedroom. I locked it as quietly as I could and pressed my back against the wall, clutching the knife like it was a lifeline. My phone was still on, still connected to 911. I dared not speak into it. I couldn't risk making a sound. The house felt suffocating now. The air was thick with tension, so thick I could barely breathe. Every little sound outside sent my nerves into overdrive. Every creak of the floorboards in the other rooms, every faint rustle outside, every second that ticked by felt like a countdown. I was frozen. My body screamed at me to move, to run, to do something, anything. But my feet were rooted to the floor like they were cemented in place. But then, just as the door handle rattled again, I heard something else. Something that made me want to believe I was dreaming. A siren. A faint sound at first, distant, almost like a whisper, but then it grew louder. My heart leaped into my throat. I didn't know if it was real, if it was some trick my mind had played on me, but the sirens kept getting louder. The sound of police cars wailing, racing toward my house broke through the terror, the faint, faraway sound of hope. I could hear the footsteps outside the door stop. Then a knock on the door. "Police!" the sound echoed. I opened the door and ran towards the front door to open it. "Ma'am, are you okay?" the officer said as I opened the door. "We've got him. He's in custody." My chest tightened again, but this time it wasn't out of fear. It was the kind of relief that felt almost like a weight being lifted. I let out a slow breath, the first real breath I had taken in what felt like hours. "Who is he?" I finally asked, my voice shaking. "What does he want?" The officer hesitated for a moment, glancing down at his notes. "His name's Kyle Dunn. He's got a history of minor offenses, mostly petty thefts, breaking and entering. Then, after a final check of the house, the officers left, and the only sound left in the house was the quiet hum of the air conditioner. I stayed up for hours that night, staring at the walls, trying to piece together what had happened, trying to process the emotions that kept rushing through me. Anger, fear, confusion, relief. It was all mixed together in a swirling, overwhelming mess. It wasn't until the sun began to rise, casting its warm, golden light over the yard outside, that I felt like I could breathe again. The nightmare was over. The man who had terrorized my thoughts for hours, who had been so close, was gone. I was safe. For now. I still can't shake off what happened that night. I've tried to move on, to pretend it was just some weird misunderstanding or maybe just a freak accident, but deep down, I know the truth. What happened to me was real. It wasn't a nightmare or some overactive imagination. It was terrifyingly real. So, let me explain. My name is Casey, and I'm a 21-year-old college student. I live in a quiet, suburban neighborhood in California. Nothing ever happens here. It's the kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked and kids ride their bikes down the street without any worries. But that night, everything changed. It all started with work. I'd been stuck late again. It wasn't unusual, really. I work at a small local coffee shop, and sometimes when we're short-staffed or just busy, I get stuck doing the late shift. On this particular night, I got off at 1:30 a.m. After a long shift of dealing with tired, grumpy customers, I was just ready to get home and crash into bed. I walked down the dimly lit streets, the cool night air brushing against my face. There was a strange silence in the air that night, too. No cars on the road, just silence. The kind of silence that makes you feel like something's off, but you can't quite figure out why. I ignored the feeling and pushed it aside, eager to get to the safety of my house. My house is pretty old. It's a 2-story home that my parents bought when I was little, and when I moved out for college, they let me stay here rent-free. It was the perfect place for me to escape from the chaos of campus life. My parents were on a week-long trip to visit family out of state, so I had the house all to myself. As I pulled into my driveway, I felt that odd sense of unease again. I wasn't sure what it was, but something felt strange. The house looked normal, just the way it always did. I parked my car, grabbed my bag, and walked up to the front door. My first instinct was to check under the plant pot where I always kept my spare key. But it wasn't there. I froze for a second, staring at the empty space where the key had always been hidden. My stomach dropped. I reached for the front door, and for some reason, it wasn't locked. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I must have been in a hurry earlier, right? I thought. I must have forgotten to hide the key again. Maybe the wind blew it away. There had to be a logical explanation. I let myself inside, locking the door behind me with extra care, my eyes scanning the dark hallway. The place was eerily quiet, and the dim light from the street lamps outside barely made it through the curtains. I told myself I was being paranoid and that I was just tired from the long day. Nothing was out of the ordinary, right? I dropped my bag onto the couch, kicked off my shoes, and went to the kitchen to get some water. That's when I heard it. A soft creak. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but I stopped in my tracks, my heart skipping a beat. I stood still, listening. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling. Houses make noises, right? Maybe it was the pipes or the wood. But then I heard it again. This time it was louder, a distinct creak. Creak. Almost like someone was walking slowly across the floor above me. The attic. The thought struck me instantly. The attic was just above the living room, and even though I hadn't been up there in a while, I knew it was empty. At least I thought it was. I didn't move for a second, my body frozen in place. I could feel my heartbeat echoing in my chest, the hairs on my arms prickling. My mind raced, but I couldn't make sense of it. Was it just my imagination? Or was there someone up there? I convinced myself to dismiss the thought. It had to be the house, right? It was old. It had to make those noises sometimes. Maybe I was just overly tired and my brain was playing tricks on me. I turned back to the kitchen to finish filling my glass, but the noise came again. Step, step. My blood ran cold. It was clear now. Someone was up there. Someone was walking around in the attic. I felt my stomach drop. The fear hit me in waves, and I didn't know what to do. I considered calling the police, but what if it was just my mind playing tricks? What if it was nothing? But what if it wasn't? I grabbed my phone off the counter and stared at it for a moment, my fingers shaking. My thumb hovered over the screen. What was I supposed to do? I couldn't just ignore it. Not after hearing those footsteps. I swallowed hard and started to dial 911. My heart was thudding loudly in my ears, and I could feel the cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. Just as I was about to press the call button, I heard something different. Something worse. A loud thud. I jumped, dropping my phone onto the counter. My mind was racing now. What the hell was going on? I felt my knees buckle slightly as the fear sank in. Someone was in my house. It wasn't just the attic anymore. I could hear the creaks getting louder. My hand shook as I picked up the phone again, dialing 911, whispering frantically into the receiver. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher asked. I think someone's in my house, I whispered, my voice trembling. "Stay quiet," the operator replied immediately. "Lock yourself in a room. We're sending someone over now. Stay on the line and don't make any noise." I could feel my entire body go stiff. The operator stayed on the line, but I couldn't focus on the words. My mind was on the sound, on the footsteps above me, the breathing that sounded closer now. Without thinking, I bolted toward the bathroom, locking the door behind me. I crouched in the corner, my legs trembling. I pressed my hand over my mouth, trying to keep from making any sound. The silence that followed was deafening. I waited, my body tense, eyes glued to the door. Minutes passed, or was it hours? Time blurred. All I could hear was the pounding of my heart in my ears. It felt like an eternity, sitting there in the corner of that bathroom. The only sound was my shallow breathing, trying desperately not to make a single noise. Every time I dared to move, even just a little, the floorboards outside would creak, sending my heart into a frenzy. I kept my phone tight in my hand, the 911 operator still on the line, though I could barely focus on her words. She kept repeating the same thing over and over. "Stay quiet. Stay locked in your room. The police are on their way." The worst part was how everything felt so normal, yet so terrifyingly wrong. The house was dark, I was alone, and someone had been walking around above me. Another slow creak from above. This time, the footsteps felt closer. I dared not move. My legs were starting to cramp from the awkward position I was sitting in, but I didn't want to risk making any sound. I tried to calm myself down, to tell myself that I had already done the right thing by calling the police. They were on their way. They had to be. Minutes passed. The sirens were so close now. I thought I could hear footsteps outside, and for the first time in what felt like forever, a strange, almost relieved thought passed through my mind. The police are here. But just as I thought that, the sound from above came again, the thud of something heavy dropping onto the attic floor. It was unmistakable. The man was still up there. And now, I could feel the weight of his presence in the house even more than before. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. A loud, sudden chime echoed through the house, and I jumped, almost knocking over a shelf behind me. It was the police. They were at the front door. I let out a shuddering breath, relief flooding over me. The thought of finally being rescued felt like a distant dream. It felt too good to be true. And then a loud crash broke through the silence, the unmistakable sound of a door being forced open. "Police!" A voice boomed. It was a deep, commanding voice, definitely a cop. I could hear voices from the other room, muffled shouts, the sound of doors opening and closing. And then I could hear the shuffle of feet on the floor, and then in the distance, the sound of an attic hatch creaking open. My stomach dropped. This was it, the attic. The footsteps I had been hearing earlier, the breathing, it had all led to this moment. "Get down! Get down on the ground!" Another voice shouted, followed by the sound of something or someone scrambling around. I could hear the police moving quickly now, their boots thudding against the wooden floors, the hiss of their radios crackling in the background. I didn't know how long it had been since I first locked myself in the bathroom, but everything seemed to be moving in slow motion. I stayed still, straining to hear what was happening, praying that this nightmare would be over soon. The sound of a man grunting, his voice ragged, cut through the air. "Get him! He's got a knife!" one of the officers yelled. I heard a struggle, the noise of bodies colliding, but then silence. The type of silence that settles after something is over. The kind where you know the danger has passed and the threat is no longer there. But I didn't want to believe it until I knew for sure. I stood up slowly, trembling, and inched toward the bathroom door, gripping the handle with a mix of fear and desperate hope. My pulse was still racing, my legs shaky, but I forced myself to turn the knob and open the door. I needed to see if they had found him, needed to make sure he wasn't hiding somewhere in the house. When I stepped into the hallway, I saw them. The officers. They were gathered in the living room, They were talking to each other, but their voices were low, and I couldn't hear them clearly. One officer stood over the man they'd apprehended. His clothes were ragged, his face pale and gaunt. His eyes were wide, crazed almost, and his expression sent a chill down my spine. He looked feral. The officer had him pinned down, his hands gripping the man's wrists, and the knife was lying just a few feet away on the floor. It looked so small in comparison to the fear that had been swirling inside me for what felt like hours. "You okay?" one of the officers asked, looking at me with a concerned expression. I nodded shakily, not trusting myself to speak. I wasn't sure what to say. How could I describe what I had felt, knowing that someone was in my house, someone who had been watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? The thought of it made my head spin. As they started to lead the man away in handcuffs, the officer who had spoken to me earlier walked over and gently placed a hand on my shoulder. "We'll take care of everything from here," he said, his voice soft. "You're safe now." I wasn't sure if I believed him. I wasn't sure if I'd ever feel truly safe again. The police, before leaving, checked every corner of the house, every closet, every room, making sure there were no other surprises. As the officers left, one of them turned to me once more. "The man who broke in used your spare key to get inside," he said quietly. "We believe he'd been watching you for days, learning your schedule. He knew when you'd be home and when you'd be gone. He'd been waiting for the right moment to make his move." I stared at him, unable to speak. All I could do was nod. The thought of him knowing my routine, knowing when I would be home, made my skin crawl. I never once thought something like that could happen to me, but it had, and I would never, ever feel completely safe in my own home again. And now I never leave a spare key anywhere, not under a pot, not in a hidden spot. I've learned the hard way, some things should never be left for anyone else to find.